Hello everyone, and welcome back to Spooky Hut. I know many of you listen to these videos to help you fall asleep, so before you doze off, it would be great if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. If you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Now let's get cozy, relax, and get started. There's something primal about being alone in the wilderness at night. It's not just the silence or the cold, but the way the darkness wraps around you, like it knows you don't belong there. I used to think the woods were beautiful, serene. I don't think that anymore. My name is Daniel, and I'm 32 years old. I've always been drawn to the outdoors, seeking solace in the isolation of nature. But after what happened last fall, deep in the Oregon wilderness, I don't know if I'll ever set foot in the woods again. It was supposed to be a solo trip, 5 days in the remote backcountry, miles away from any trail or human contact. Just me, my pack, and the endless stretch of trees. I had done this sort of thing before, but this time, something felt different. The air was heavy with an unspoken tension, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. On the third night, the unease settled in. I had set up camp by a small lake, the kind of place where the water is so still it mirrors the sky above. I spent the day fishing and gathering wood, trying to enjoy the quiet. But as the sun set, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. At first, I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. I was alone in the wilderness after all. It was normal to feel a little paranoid. But then I heard it. A rustling in the underbrush, too deliberate to be the wind. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was faint but distinct, like something large was moving through the trees. I tried to convince myself it was a deer or maybe a bear, but deep down I knew it wasn't. The noise grew closer, the sound of branches snapping underfoot, and then nothing. The silence that followed was worse than the noise itself. I stood there, flashlight in hand, straining to see anything beyond the beam of light cutting through the darkness. But there was nothing, just trees and shadows. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I told myself I was being ridiculous. I packed up camp and moved further into the wilderness, trying to put distance between myself and whatever had spooked me the night before. But the feeling followed me. It was like the forest was alive, watching me, tracking my every move. By the time I set up camp that evening, the tension had settled into my bones. I built a larger fire than usual, hoping the light would push back the creeping darkness. The night was colder too, a biting chill that seemed unnatural for early fall. As I huddled by the fire, I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something, anything, lurking in the shadows. Then I heard it again. This time, it was closer. The rustling, the snapping of branches, the unmistakable sound of something moving in the dark. But it wasn't just moving, it was circling. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the trees, my hands shaking. The beam flickered and wavered, but I saw nothing. No eyes reflecting back at me, no movement, just endless blackness. But I could hear it, the breathing, low and guttural just beyond the light. Then, a howl split the air. It wasn't an animal. It couldn't be. The sound was too human, yet not. It was like something imitating a human, mimicking the sound of a person in pain, but twisted in a way that made my blood run cold. The howl echoed through the trees, bouncing off the rocks and making it impossible to tell where it came from. I backed toward the fire, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't want to turn my back on the trees, but I needed the light, needed the warmth. The howling stopped, but the forest was still alive with the sound of something moving, something watching. Suddenly there was a loud crash, a tree branch breaking, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps pounding toward me. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet as I fumbled for my knife. The footsteps stopped just at the edge of the firelight, and for a moment, I saw it. A figure, tall and gaunt, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones, standing just outside the reach of the flames. Its eyes were hollow, black pits, staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. And then it was gone. I don't know how long I stood there, my knife clenched in my hand, waiting for it to come back. Minutes? Hours? The fire crackled softly, but the woods were silent again. I didn't sleep that night either. I just sat by the fire, listening, waiting. When the sun finally rose, I packed up and started hiking. I didn't care where, I just needed to get away from that place. But no matter how far I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was following me, watching me, waiting. By midday, I found a clearing where I stopped to catch my breath. The trees here were sparse, the ground littered with dead leaves. As I stood there trying to calm the panic rising in my chest, I heard it again. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the trees. I spun around, but there was no one there. Just the trees, swaying in the wind. But I knew better now. I knew it was out there, hiding in the shadows, waiting for me to let my guard down. And then I saw it, something moving between the trees, just a blur of pale skin and dark eyes. It was faster this time, darting between the trunks like it was toying with me. My heart raced, and I bolted. I ran through the forest, not caring about the direction, just desperate to get away. My legs burned and my lungs screamed for air, but I didn't stop. Not until I stumbled into a ravine, the ground falling away beneath my feet. I tumbled down, hitting rocks and roots as I went. When I finally came to a stop, I was lying at the bottom of the ravine, gasping for breath. My ankle throbbed, and I knew it was sprained, but I didn't care. I forced myself to sit up, my head spinning, and that's when I saw it again. Standing at the top of the ravine, staring down at me with those hollow black eyes. Its body was twisted, its limbs too long, its skin too tight. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just watched. I don't remember much after that. I must have passed out because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The sun was shining, and the creature was gone. My ankle was swollen and bruised, but I managed to limp my way out of the ravine and back to the trail. I don't know how I made it out of those woods. I must have walked for hours, maybe days. But eventually, I found a ranger station, and they helped me get back to civilization. I tried to explain what happened, but no one believed me. They said it was the cold, the isolation, that my mind had played tricks on me. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. There's something in the deep wilderness, something that watches and waits, something that doesn't want you to leave. And sometimes, it follows you home. I always thought those stories about cursed objects were just that, stories, until one day I found myself face to face with something so malevolent that it made me question everything I thought I knew about the world. It all began when I inherited an old wooden chest from my great-uncle Bernard, a man I barely knew, but who had a reputation for collecting oddities. My mother said Bernard was eccentric, obsessed with ancient relics and the occult, but I never paid much attention. The chest arrived at my doorstep on a rainy afternoon, its surface weathered and scarred, the brass lock gleaming dully under the dim light. I wasn't superstitious, so I didn't hesitate to open it. Inside, I found a collection of items that looked like they belonged in a museum or a haunted house. There was a tarnished silver locket, a cracked mirror no bigger than my hand, a small, ancient-looking dagger, and a peculiar porcelain doll with faded, glassy eyes. Each item seemed to carry a weight of its own, an invisible pull that made my skin prickle as if I wasn't alone in the room. At the bottom of the chest was a letter, written in shaky, faded ink. It read, "These objects are cursed. They have been the cause of death and destruction in my life. Beware. They bring nothing but misery. Do not keep them. Destroy them if you can." I laughed nervously, dismissing the warning as the paranoid ramblings of an old man. Who believes in curses nowadays? But I kept the letter. It was a curious addition to the strange collection after all. The trouble started the next day. I decided to display the objects in my living room. The locket hung on the mantel, the mirror rested on a shelf, and the doll sat quietly in a corner, its glassy eyes following me wherever I went. For some reason, I couldn't bring myself to get rid of them, even though I felt a growing unease every time I walked past. That night, I woke up to the sound of whispering. At first I thought it was a dream, but the soft, eerie voices persisted, like they were coming from inside the walls. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and strained to listen. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but I could hear it, a chorus of whispers, speaking in a language I didn't understand. I forced myself to get out of bed and follow the sound, though every instinct screamed at me to stay put. The whispers led me to the living room, where the cursed objects sat in the dim moonlight. The doll's eyes seemed to glitter more brightly than before, and the air in the room was thick with something I couldn't explain. I turned on the lights, and the whispers stopped instantly. The room was silent, but the heavy feeling of being watched remained. That was the first night. The next day, I started feeling off. I couldn't explain it, but it was as if something was tugging at my mind, slowly wearing me down. I was tired, irritable, and felt an overwhelming sense of dread that clung to me like a shadow. Every time I passed the living room, the objects seemed different, as though they had shifted ever so slightly when I wasn't looking. It was the doll that disturbed me the most. I had always hated dolls, but this one felt particularly wrong. Its expression seemed to change when I wasn't paying attention. Sometimes its tiny lips would curve into the faintest of smiles, and other times its eyes looked hungry. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was just tired, but by the end of the week, I couldn't shake the feeling that the doll was more than just a lifeless toy. That night, I had the worst dream of my life. In the dream, I was standing in my living room, staring at the chest and its cursed contents. The room was darker than usual, the shadows long and suffocating. The objects seemed to glow faintly, as though they were alive. Suddenly, the doll's head jerked to the side and it stood up, its porcelain feet scraping against the floor. It moved toward me, its glassy eyes fixed on mine, unblinking. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My body felt paralyzed, frozen in place, as the doll reached out with its tiny, delicate hands. It touched my arm, and an icy wave of terror shot through me. Then I woke up. Except, I wasn't sure if I was awake. I sat up in bed, drenched in sweat, my heart racing. The room was pitch black, but I could hear something moving. Slowly, carefully, I reached for the lamp beside my bed and flicked it on. The room lit up, revealing nothing out of place. But then I saw it, the doll, sitting at the foot of my bed. I screamed, stumbling out of bed and backing away. How had it gotten there? I had left it in the living room. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but there was no logical explanation. I grabbed the doll and threw it into the hallway, slamming the door behind me. For hours I sat in my room, too terrified to sleep, listening for any sign of movement outside the door. But there was nothing. In the morning, I found the doll back in its place in the living room, sitting quietly among the other cursed objects. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't throw it away. Something inside me wouldn't let me. It felt like the objects were binding themselves to me, feeding off my fear and confusion. Things escalated quickly after that. Objects would move around the house on their own, and strange, unsettling noises filled the nights. Footsteps in the attic, whispers in the walls, doors creaking open on their own. I felt like I was losing my mind. One evening, I invited a friend over, hoping their presence would help dispel the growing terror in my home. We sat in the living room talking about everything except the cursed objects, though I could see my friend glancing nervously at the doll. Halfway through our conversation, the mirror on the shelf suddenly cracked. The sound was sharp, like a gunshot, and we both jumped to our feet. My friend paled, their eyes wide. "You need to get rid of these things," they said, backing toward the door. "I can't," I whispered. "I've tried." They left soon after, and I never saw them again. The deaths began not long after that. At first it was distant, people I didn't know but who were somehow connected to me. A neighbor died in a freak accident, their car veering off the road for no apparent reason. Then a colleague at work dropped dead from a sudden heart attack, though they'd always been in perfect health. It wasn't until my cousin died, someone I was close to, that I realized the curse was spreading. The cursed objects were taking their toll, claiming lives around me, and I was powerless to stop it. I tried to destroy them. I took the mirror and shattered it with a hammer, but the next day, it was whole again, sitting on the shelf as though nothing had happened. I burned the locket, but it reappeared, gleaming and untarnished. No matter what I did, the objects always came back, stronger and more malicious than before. Now, I'm writing this as a final warning, just like my great-uncle did. I don't know how much time I have left. The objects have claimed too many lives, and I fear I'm next. They're always watching, always waiting. If you ever come across a chest filled with cursed objects, don't open it. Don't take anything. Run, because once you let them into your life, there's no escaping the curse. And death, once it has found you, will not be denied. It started with a faint tapping, like someone knocking from deep within the earth beneath my feet. At first I brushed it off as old house noises, pipes settling, or maybe even the creak of the ancient wooden beams that held up the place. But then the taps became knocks, heavy and rhythmic, pulsing through the floor like a heartbeat I couldn't ignore. I live alone in a 19th century house that I inherited from my grandfather. It's one of those homes that people cross the street to avoid, with its ivy-covered walls and perpetually dim windows. The locals called it cursed. Nothing more than old-town superstition, I thought. I'm not the superstitious type, but that was before the night I heard something scratching at the basement door. I had just settled into bed when the sound reached me, sharp, deliberate, like claws against wood. It was persistent, louder than the usual groans of the house. My chest tightened. I knew I was alone, and the basement door was locked, always locked. After lying there for what felt like hours, I convinced myself it was probably a rodent. It had to be. I kept telling myself that as I pulled the blanket up higher, shutting my eyes against the darkness. But the scratching didn't stop. It was as if whatever was down there wanted out. By morning, the noise had ceased, but I couldn't shake the unease that lingered like a shadow over my every thought. I stood by the basement door, my hand hovering over the cold brass handle. For a moment, I considered opening it, but something in the pit of my stomach churned. I backed away, telling myself I'd check it later, when the sun was up. Days passed without incident, and I was beginning to believe it had all been in my head. Until the power went out. It was a Friday evening, and I was in the middle of a late-night movie marathon when the house went dark. The wind had been howling outside all night, so I chalked it up to the storm. I grabbed a flashlight and headed for the breaker box, downstairs in the basement. My skin prickled with every step as I descended into the pitch-black corridor leading to the basement. The air grew colder with each step, the silence wrapping itself around me like a shroud. I stood before the door, hesitating as the beam from my flashlight flickered and dimmed. Taking a deep breath, I unlocked the door, forcing it open with a loud creak. The basement was always unnervingly cold, but tonight it was freezing. I could see my breath forming little clouds as I descended the stairs, the dim flashlight offering just enough light to see ahead. The breaker box sat in the far corner, right where the shadows were the thickest. As I crossed the room, I felt a weight in the air, like something was watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. Just as I reached the box, my flashlight went out. I froze, swallowed by the darkness. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, but I tried to stay calm. I felt around for the switch, fumbling blindly in the dark. That's when I heard it, the slow, deliberate shuffle of feet behind me. I whipped around, my breath catching in my throat. The basement was silent, but the feeling of being watched intensified. I wasn't alone. I could feel it. A soft whisper floated through the cold air, too faint to make out the words, but close enough that I felt the icy breath brush against my neck. I backed up, trying to steady my trembling hands as I frantically flipped the breaker switches. The lights flickered back on, and for a brief second, I saw something at the bottom of the stairs. A figure, impossibly tall, its face obscured by shadows. It vanished the moment the room lit up. I stood frozen, staring at the now empty stairwell. I couldn't trust my eyes, couldn't explain what I had just seen. My mind raced, but all I could think was to get out of there, fast. For the next few days, I stayed out of the basement. Whatever was down there, I wanted nothing to do with it. But the house had other plans. The noises returned, louder this time. Not just scratching, but whispers, and the sound of footsteps pacing back and forth behind the locked basement door. No matter how many locks I put on it, they never seemed to hold, and each time I checked, the door was slightly ajar. One night, after a particularly unsettling series of thuds, I worked up the courage to investigate again. Armed with a crowbar and the brightest flashlight I could find, I descended into the basement. Everything was as it had been before, cold, dark, and silent. But this time, I noticed something new. In the far corner, beneath the old wooden stairs, there was a small, rusted trapdoor. I had never seen it before, but it was unmistakably there, half hidden beneath years of dust and debris. My pulse quickened as I crouched down and pried the door open. A blast of cold, stale air hit me as I shined my flashlight into the darkness below. The beam barely reached the bottom, but I could make out what looked like a narrow tunnel carved into the earth. A sickening feeling twisted in my gut. Everything in me screamed to leave it alone, but something, curiosity or madness, pulled me forward. I climbed down. The tunnel was cramped, the walls closing in on me as I made my way deeper underground. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something metallic, like blood. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel opened up into a small chamber. My flashlight flickered as I scanned the room, and that's when I saw it. The walls were covered in strange, crude carvings, symbols I didn't recognize, etched deep into the stone. In the center of the room was a circle of candles, long since extinguished, surrounding what looked like an altar. And lying on the altar, covered in dust, was a book. It was ancient, bound in a leather that had long since dried and cracked. I stepped closer, my hands shaking as I reached for it. But before I could touch it, the room seemed to shift. The air grew heavier, and a low, guttural voice echoed from the shadows. "Leave." I spun around, but there was no one there, just the oppressive darkness pressing in on all sides. The voice came again, louder this time. "Leave." I bolted, scrambling up the tunnel as fast as I could, the sound of footsteps following me all the way to the top. As I burst into the basement, I slammed the trapdoor shut and locked it, my heart hammering in my chest. Since that night, I've never been back down to the basement. I had the door boarded up, and I've tried to forget what I saw, tried to convince myself it was all just a nightmare. But the house won't let me. The sounds haven't stopped. They've only gotten worse. Every night, I hear the scratching. Every night, I hear the whispers. And now, I'm not sure it's just in the basement anymore. There are some things in this world you should never go looking for. Some things you should never call out to, even when you're desperate enough to believe they'll answer. I learned this the hard way. It all started last winter, deep in the forests of northern Minnesota, where the snow piles high and the cold sinks into your bones like a disease. My name's Ethan. I'm 32, and I've lived my entire life in this remote wilderness. Hunting, trapping, guiding tourists, Survival was something I was raised on, but even out here, I'd never seen anything like this. Not until the night everything changed. It was December, the heart of a brutal winter, the kind of cold that leaves your lungs burning and your skin numb. I was out hunting, tracking a herd of deer that had wandered farther north than usual. Food had become scarce, and the deeper I went into the forest, the more isolated I felt. I liked it that way. Solitude was something I craved. The cabin I was staying in was miles from the nearest town, built by my grandfather decades ago. A small, one-room shack with creaky wooden floors, a fireplace, and walls that seemed to groan with the weight of years. It was old, but it was home. The days were short, and by the time I returned from hunting that evening, the sky was a deep purple, the kind that promised an unforgiving night. I dragged the deer carcass inside, shutting the door quickly behind me to keep out the biting wind. The fire had long gone out, leaving the cabin cold and dark, but something felt off, like the air itself had grown thicker, heavier. Then came the sound. A low, eerie wail carried on the wind. At first I thought it was an animal, wolves maybe. But no, this was different. It sounded human, almost like someone crying out in pain. My heart raced as I pressed my ear to the window, the sound growing louder, more desperate. My mind raced, but I knew there wasn't another person for miles around. Who could possibly be out there, in this cold, this far from civilization? But the wail. It seemed to call out to me. I grabbed my rifle and threw on my coat. I don't know what I was thinking, but I couldn't just ignore it. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe it was curiosity. But something inside me pushed me to go out there, into the night. The moment I stepped outside, the wind hit me like a wall, howling through the trees and stinging my skin. My breath came out in clouds as I trudged through the deep snow, the light from my lantern barely cutting through the darkness. The wail came again, clearer now. It was coming from deeper in the woods, past the old hunting trail that my grandfather had always told me never to follow. "This land is cursed," he used to say. "Stay close to the cabin. Stay where it's safe." But I didn't listen. The trees closed in around me, their branches bare and twisted like skeletal hands reaching for the sky. The snow crunched beneath my boots, the only sound besides the wind. As I ventured farther from the cabin, the wail shifted, no longer sounding like a person, but something else entirely, something unnatural. Suddenly, the temperature dropped even lower. My breath froze in midair, and I could feel my blood slow as the cold took hold. My gut told me to turn back, to forget about the sound and return to the safety of the cabin, but it was too late. That's when I saw it. In the distance, just beyond the reach of my lantern, something moved between the trees. It was tall, impossibly tall, and hunched over like it was dragging something behind it. At first, I thought it was a moose, until it turned its head toward me. The face, if you could call it that, was nothing more than a gaunt, hollowed-out skull. Its eyes were black pits, endless and empty. But the mouth, it was wide, too wide, as though the skin had been stretched and torn. Bloodless lips pulled back to reveal rows of sharp, jagged teeth. My heart pounded in my chest, but I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, staring into the abyss of its gaze. It let out a growl, deep and guttural, before opening its mouth in that same horrifying wail. The sound pierced the night, louder and more terrifying than before, like the cries of the damned. And then it spoke. Ethan. My name. It knew my name. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my rifle. The snow beneath me seemed to shift, as though the earth itself was alive and trying to pull me under. I turned and ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps as the trees blurred past me. The creature's voice followed, echoing through the woods, calling out to me in a mocking tone. "Ethan! Ethan!" I didn't stop until I reached the cabin. I slammed the door shut behind me, bolting it as though that could keep whatever was out there from getting in. My hands shook as I threw more logs onto the fire, desperate for any kind of warmth, any kind of protection. But the wailing, it never stopped. I didn't sleep that night. The wails circled the cabin, relentless, as though the creature was toying with me. I could feel it watching, waiting. Hours passed, and I sat by the fire with my rifle clutched in my hands, jumping at every creak, every gust of wind. The weight of its presence pressed down on me, suffocating in its intensity. When the sun finally rose, the wails stopped, but the unease lingered. I knew then that the Wendigo was real, not just some legend passed down to scare children around the fire, and now it had my scent. It was only a matter of time. For days, I stayed in the cabin, refusing to step foot outside. My supplies dwindled, and the cold grew worse, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. Every night the wails would return, closer and more insistent. It was driving me mad, the way it whispered my name in the darkness, taunting me with its hunger. Then, on the 5th night, there was a knock at the door. At first, I thought I'd imagined it. Who could possibly be out here? But the knock came again, slow and deliberate. I grabbed my rifle and crept toward the door. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for the handle, hesitating for just a moment before pulling it open. There was no one there. But the snow... There were footprints leading up to the door. Fresh, human footprints. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what I was seeing. The Wendigo had learned to walk like a man. I never left that cabin. Not truly. Physically, I'm still here, a prisoner of the woods, haunted by the creature that stalks me every night. I hear its voice, its cries, its taunts. And no matter how much I try to block it out, it always finds a way in. The hunger never stops. And I fear, one day, I'll become like it. The moment we crossed the old wooden bridge into the mining town of Black Hollow, I felt it. The shift in the air. Not the kind you can explain, like a cold wind on a fall evening, but something that dug under your skin and sat in your chest like a stone. The whole place had been abandoned for over 50 years, but it was far from empty. I was 28 at the time, too young to know better and too stubborn to care. My buddy, Jake, had convinced me to check out Black Hollow after hearing rumors that the town wasn't just a ghost town, but literally haunted by the souls of miners who had met their deaths in a tragic collapse decades ago. People whispered that the dead still wandered the old shafts and decaying streets, waiting for someone foolish enough to venture close. Naturally, we went anyway. Jake and I had been friends since childhood, and we shared an unspoken rule: never back down from a dare. When he dared me to come with him on this ghost hunt, I couldn't refuse. We'd packed light, a couple of flashlights, a few beers, and a handheld recorder Jake thought would be cool to use if we picked up any ghost sounds. The sky was a deep, bruised purple when we arrived, the sun barely a sliver on the horizon. Perfect setting for a haunting. The old mining town had been swallowed by the mountains. It was as if nature had tried to erase any memory of its existence, with thick trees and wild brush creeping over the rusted remains of buildings and carts. Yet, as much as nature tried to claim it, the town fought back, standing as a decaying skeleton of its former self. The main street stretched out before us, narrow and crooked, lined with what were once houses and stores but were now rotting husks. The wind whistled through broken windows, carrying with it a low, almost human sigh. We made our way deeper into the town, toward the mine that had sealed the fate of Black Hollow. As we walked, the unsettling feeling only grew. It was like the town was watching us. Jake was unfazed, joking and laughing, but I couldn't shake the sensation that we weren't alone. "Bet this place was booming back in the day," Jake said, shining his flashlight on the crumbling remains of a saloon. The sign, hanging precariously by a rusted chain, read, "The Miner's Rest." I stopped and looked around. Shadows clung to the walls, seeming to shift and writhe as the beam of his light swept over them. I felt my skin prickle. We reached the entrance of the mine just as darkness fully settled. The gaping black mouth of the mine loomed before us, a cold breeze seeping out from its depths like a breath from the grave. I suddenly regretted agreeing to this. The stories we'd heard, of men trapped inside, suffocating, screaming for help that never came, felt a little too close to reality now. "Jake, maybe we should..." Before I could finish, Jake had already stepped inside, his flashlight casting long, eerie shadows on the jagged rock walls. I cursed under my breath and followed him. The mine was colder than I expected, the air damp and thick with the smell of earth and decay. Our footsteps echoed through the tunnel, each step louder than the last. The deeper we went, the stronger the feeling grew. That gnawing, oppressive sense that something was there, just beyond the edge of the light, watching. We reached what used to be a large mining chamber, the place where dozens of men had once worked. Now it was nothing but an empty pit filled with rusting equipment and the stench of abandonment. Jake pulled out his recorder and held it up. "Let's see if we can get any of those spooky sounds," he said with a grin. I stood there tense as he pressed record. For a moment there was nothing but the sound of our breathing and the faint drip of water from the cave ceiling. Then, from somewhere deep in the mine, I heard it. A low, rumbling sound, like distant thunder. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Jake shrugged. "It's probably just the wind." But it wasn't. The sound grew louder, closer, and with it came something else. A voice. Faint, almost imperceptible at first, but undeniably there. A man's voice muttering something low and unintelligible. I froze, my blood turning to ice. Jake waved his flashlight around, the beam cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. "Who's messing with us?" Jake called out, his voice cracking slightly. "Come on, show yourself." There was no answer, just the continued murmur of that voice, growing louder, angrier. It sounded like someone, or something, was right behind us. I spun around, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end, but the tunnel was empty. "Jake, we need to leave, now," I said, backing toward the entrance. Jake laughed nervously. "Relax, man. It's probably just some weird echo from the mine." But he didn't believe it any more than I did. The voice was no echo. It was real, and it was coming closer. Suddenly, Jake's flashlight flickered and died. We were plunged into darkness. My heart raced and I fumbled for my own flashlight, but my hands were shaking too much to get a grip. That's when I saw it. The faint glow of a lantern in the distance, coming from deeper within the mine. "Who's there?" Jake shouted, his voice strained with fear. The lantern's glow wavered, then started moving toward us. I grabbed Jake's arm, yanking him back toward the entrance, but he was frozen in place, staring at the light. The voice was louder now, clearer. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was many, dozens, all of them angry, desperate, calling out for help that would never come. "They're coming," Jake whispered, his eyes wide with terror. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I bolted toward the entrance, dragging Jake with me. The voices followed us, growing more frantic, more insistent, as if the dead themselves were reaching out to pull us back into the mine. We ran, stumbling over rocks and debris, until we finally burst out into the cold night air. We didn't stop running until we reached the truck, parked just outside of town. I slammed the door shut and fumbled for the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely start the engine. When I finally got the truck going, I floored it, speeding away from Black Hollow as fast as the old vehicle would go. Neither of us spoke the entire drive back to town. It wasn't until we were safely inside Jake's apartment, the door locked behind us, that we dared to breathe again. Jake pulled out the recorder, his hands still trembling. "Maybe we got something," he said, though his voice was hollow. He hit play. For the first few seconds, all we could hear was our own breathing and footsteps. Then came the voices, clear as day. They were calling out, just as they had in the mine. And then, just before the recording ended, one voice cut through the rest, louder, more distinct. A single word, spoken with a bone-chilling certainty. Stay. We stared at each other in silence, the reality of what we'd encountered sinking in. The town of Black Hollow wasn't just haunted, it was alive, filled with the restless souls of those who had died there. And they weren't done with us. We never spoke of that night again. But sometimes, late at night when everything is quiet, I swear I can still hear them. Those voices, calling out from the darkness, waiting for me to return. When I inherited my grandfather's cabin deep in the Appalachian Mountains, I thought it was the perfect escape from the chaos of city life. The cabin sat miles from the nearest town, nestled in a thick forest, where the only sounds were the rustle of leaves and the occasional howl of distant wildlife. It sounded like paradise, until I actually got there. The day I arrived, I was 31, freshly divorced, and ready to leave behind everything I once knew. I had no other family, so when the lawyer called to inform me of the inheritance, I didn't hesitate to take it. The cabin had been left untouched since my grandfather's passing 10 years prior. As a child, I'd only visited it once, a faint memory that had now blurred with time. The long dirt road leading to the cabin was flanked by towering trees that seemed to close in around me the deeper I drove. There were no power lines, no neighbors, no sign of human life at all. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was dipping low behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the property. The place looked exactly how I imagined, a wooden structure that had weathered years of isolation, but still sturdy enough to withstand the elements. I parked the car and stood in front of the cabin for a moment, taking it all in. It felt surreal to be there, standing on land that had been in my family for generations, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe it was the thick, unnerving silence that hung over the forest, but something about the place felt wrong. The front door creaked open when I pushed it, revealing a dusty but surprisingly well-preserved interior. The air was musty, and the wooden floors groaned under my weight as I explored the rooms. The cabin had only one bedroom, a small kitchen, and a living area with an old fireplace. Everything had been left exactly as it was the last time someone had been there. My grandfather's coat still hung on a hook by the door, and a half-empty coffee cup sat on the kitchen table, long since abandoned. I felt an eerie chill run down my spine, but I brushed it off. It was just an old house, and old houses always felt strange at first. That night, after unpacking a few of my belongings and settling in, I built a fire in the fireplace and opened a bottle of whiskey. The silence outside was almost suffocating, but I tried to embrace it, telling myself it was exactly what I needed to clear my mind. Yet, as the fire crackled and shadows danced along the walls, that nagging feeling of unease crept back in. I decided to explore the rest of the cabin, hoping that familiarity would settle my nerves. There was a small door in the back of the living room, half hidden behind a heavy wooden cabinet. I didn't remember it from my childhood visit, but then again, I was only a kid back then. Pushing the cabinet aside, I pulled the door open, revealing a steep set of stairs that led into a basement. The air that wafted up from below was cold and damp, carrying with it a faint metallic odor. My flashlight barely pierced the darkness as I descended the steps, each creak of the old wood echoing louder than it should have in the enclosed space. The basement was larger than I expected, its walls lined with shelves filled with tools, jars, and old cans. At the far end of the room was an old wooden trunk, covered in dust. I approached the trunk slowly, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. Something about it felt wrong, but I couldn't place why. My hand hovered over the latch for a moment before I finally lifted it. The lid creaked open, and I stepped back, half expecting something to leap out at me. But inside, there were only old papers, yellowed with age. I picked up one of the papers and held it up to the light. It was a journal, written in my grandfather's shaky handwriting. The entries were dated from the year before he died. Flipping through the pages, one word kept appearing over and over again. Shadows. "They're watching," one entry read. "The shadows are alive. They whisper in the dark, just beyond the firelight." My heart began to race as I skimmed through more entries. They move when you're not looking. They're not human. They've been here long before us. They wait. I slammed the journal shut, my pulse thundering in my ears. I stuffed the papers back into the trunk, suddenly feeling like I was being watched. I climbed the stairs quickly, closing the basement door behind me. I told myself it was just the ramblings of an old man who had spent too much time alone in the woods. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind outside had me wide awake, staring at the dark corners of the room, half expecting to see something move. The shadows in the cabin seemed to stretch and twist in the flickering firelight, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just out of sight. The next few days passed uneventfully, though the strange feeling of being watched never left. I spent most of my time outside, exploring the forest surrounding the cabin. It was dense, with old-growth trees that towered over me, their branches twisting together to form a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. The deeper I ventured, the more isolated I felt, as though I had wandered into a place untouched by time. On the third day, while hiking along a narrow path I hadn't noticed before, I found something that stopped me in my tracks. A clearing with a small old cemetery. There were no more than 10 graves, each marked with a simple stone slab. The names were so worn down that I could barely make them out. But one thing was clear, they were all from the late 1800s. I knelt by one of the graves, running my hand over the rough stone. My fingers caught on a deep groove in the slab, and when I looked closer, I saw that someone had carved a single word beneath the name: shadows. A cold shiver ran through me, and I stood up quickly, glancing around the clearing. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches swaying in a wind I couldn't feel. I suddenly had the overwhelming urge to leave, to get as far away from that place as possible. When I returned to the cabin, the sun was setting, casting long, jagged shadows across the forest floor. As I stepped onto the porch, I noticed something strange. The basement door, the one I had shut tight, was ajar. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. Slowly, I approached the door, every instinct telling me to turn around and leave, but I couldn't. I had to know. I opened the door wider and descended the stairs. The basement was cold, the air thick with that same metallic smell. My flashlight flickered as I swept it across the room, and then I saw it. The shadows. They weren't just dark shapes cast by the dim light. They were moving, twisting, writhing, like something alive, creeping along the walls and floor. My breath caught in my throat as I realized they were coming toward me. I backed up, but before I could reach the stairs, I heard it. A whisper. Soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. "We've been waiting." I spun around, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness, but there was no one there. Just the shadows growing larger, closer. Panicking, I ran up the stairs, slamming the door behind me. I could still hear the whispers, faint but insistent, coming from the basement. I grabbed my keys and bolted out of the cabin, not even bothering to lock the door behind me. As I sped down the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin was barely visible through the trees, but I could see them. The shadows spilling out of the cabin, stretching toward me, their whispers still echoing in my ears. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town. I checked into a motel and locked the door, but even then, I couldn't escape the feeling that they were still there, watching, waiting for me to return. That was months ago. I never went back to the cabin, and I never will. But sometimes, late at night, when the room is dark and the shadows grow long, I still hear them, whispering. I never believed in urban legends, and if you'd asked me before that night, I would have laughed at the idea of black-eyed children. But now, I can't laugh. Not after what happened. It was late, well past midnight, and I was alone in the house. My wife had taken the kids to visit her mother for the weekend, so the silence was thick, almost unnatural. I liked the quiet, though, usually. That night, it was different. A heavy, eerie stillness hung in the air, pressing in on me like the weight of a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The wind outside howled against the windows, and every once in a while the house creaked and groaned as if it, too, was uneasy. I sat on the couch, half watching TV, half listening to the storm outside, when I heard it. A knock. 3 sharp, distinct raps on the front door. I froze. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere at this time of night? My nearest neighbor lived a mile away, and they weren't the type to drop by unannounced, especially not in this weather. I waited, hoping it was just a trick of the wind. But then, the knock came again. Louder this time, more insistent. I got up slowly, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. My mind raced, every horror story I'd ever heard suddenly rushing to the surface. Grabbing the baseball bat I kept by the door, I walked to the entryway and paused, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I wasn't sure why, but every instinct screamed at me not to open the door. Something wasn't right, but the knocking didn't stop. It came again, a third time, slow, deliberate, like they knew I was standing there, waiting, and they weren't going anywhere until I answered. I took a deep breath, unlocked the door, and cracked it open. There, standing on my porch, were 2 kids, a boy and a girl, both around 10 or 11 years old, soaking wet from the rain. They wore old-fashioned clothes, oddly neat for the weather, and stood side by side, perfectly still, heads down so I couldn't see their faces clearly. "Can we come in?" The boy's voice was flat, almost robotic, as if he were reading from a script. The girl said nothing, just stood there shivering. I should have felt bad for them, should have opened the door wide and let them in to get warm. But something was off. It wasn't just their clothes or their strange stillness. It was deeper. I cleared my throat, trying to shake off the unease. Are you guys lost? Do you need help?" The boy lifted his head slowly, and when his eyes met mine, I felt my stomach drop. They were black. Not dark brown or shadowed by the night. Solid black, like 2 bottomless pits. No whites, no pupils, just endless darkness. And when the girl looked up, her eyes were the same. 2 hollow voids staring at me. I stumbled back, gripping the door harder. Every instinct screamed at me to slam it shut, but I couldn't move. My body felt frozen, rooted to the spot. "Let us in," the boy said again, his voice more forceful this time. "We need to come inside." "No." I barely managed to choke out the word, my throat dry and tight. "Please," the girl whispered, finally speaking. Her voice was soft, almost pleading, but there was no emotion behind it, just a hollow echo. "We're cold. We need to come in." I shook my head, stepping back as the door began to close on its own, as if the house itself was trying to protect me. But before it could fully shut, the boy reached out, his hand gripping the edge of the doorframe. His fingers were ice cold, and I gasped at the unnatural strength in his small hand. "Don't be afraid," he said, and for the first time, a flicker of something, anger, frustration, crossed his expressionless face. "We just need to come inside. Let us in." I yanked the door shut, slamming it so hard the whole house shook. My heart pounded in my chest, the echo of their voices still ringing in my ears. For a moment I stood there, breathless, waiting to hear if they'd knock again. But there was nothing, only the sound of the wind and the rain outside. I checked the lock 3 times before backing away, retreating into the living room. I tried to convince myself that it had been a hallucination, a trick of my mind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, watching, waiting. I grabbed my phone and dialed my wife's number, my hands shaking. She picked up on the third ring, her voice groggy from sleep. "Hey, everything okay?" she asked. I opened my mouth to answer, but before I could say anything, I heard it again. The knocking. 3 slow, deliberate raps, louder than before. I gotta go," I stammered, hanging up before she could ask any more questions. I turned to the front door, my heart hammering in my chest. The knocking came again, harder this time, more insistent, but I wasn't going to answer it. I wasn't going to let them in. The lights flickered and the room plunged into darkness. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for my flashlight, the darkness pressing in like a suffocating blanket. When I finally found it and clicked it on, the beam of light fell on the front door. They were still there. Through the small window at the top of the door, I could see them standing on the porch, staring in. Their black eyes locked onto mine, their faces eerily calm. The girl raised her hand and knocked again, her knuckles rapping against the glass in a slow, deliberate rhythm. "Let us in," she whispered, her voice carrying through the storm, clear as day. "You have to let us in." I backed away, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I didn't know what they were, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let them inside. The power flickered back on, and for a brief, terrifying moment, I thought they'd be gone. That somehow the light would chase them away. But no. They stood there, as still as statues, their black eyes unblinking. I did the only thing I could think of. I ran to the back of the house, locked myself in the bedroom, and prayed they would go away. I didn't sleep that night. I sat there, listening to the rain, the occasional knock, and the eerie silence that followed. When morning finally came, I crept back to the front door, half expecting to see them still standing there. But they were gone. No sign of them. No footprints in the mud. No evidence that they'd ever been there at all. But I know what I saw. I know what happened. And I know they'll be back. Because that night, as I lay in bed, unable to sleep, I remembered something. Something they said. "You have to let us in." It wasn't a request, it was a warning, and next time I don't think I'll have a choice. I knew I shouldn't have taken the job, but when you're desperate and the pay is right, you ignore that gnawing feeling in your gut. That was me a month ago, standing at the edge of the world, on a frozen wasteland of ice and nothingness. No one tells you how vast the Arctic really is until you see it for yourself. The endless white stretches on forever, a desert of ice hiding things we weren't meant to find. And something found us. It started with a crack, a deep, thunderous groan from the ice below. I was out collecting samples with 2 others, barely 50 yards from our research station. The ice cracked like a whip beneath our feet, causing a jolt of panic. But it wasn't the crack that scared me. It was what I saw beneath it, through that thin sheet of ice, in the darkness below. Something was moving. We were stationed in the northernmost part of Greenland, sent to study the effects of climate change on the Arctic's glaciers. It sounded like an adventure at the time, a few months of isolation, gathering data, then heading home to a paycheck bigger than I'd ever seen. I didn't expect to find myself questioning my sanity within weeks of arriving. I didn't say anything to the others that day, Dr. Lyle, the team lead, and Carver, our field technician. What could I have said? "I think I saw something moving under the ice." They'd have laughed, or worse, thought I was losing it. And I wasn't sure I wasn't. But the cracking continued. Small at first, barely noticeable. Every day there were more, larger, spreading in spiderweb patterns across the surface. Lyle said it was the ice shifting, typical for this time of year. But something didn't sit right with me. Those cracks. They seemed too deliberate, too alive. I didn't sleep much after that. My mind played tricks on me, imagining shapes in the shadows outside our station. I would hear scratching sounds in the dead of night, faint and rhythmic, like something was scraping at the ice from underneath. But every time I checked, there was nothing there. only the wind howling across the barren landscape. 2 weeks in, Carver went missing. He'd been out collecting samples, same routine as every other day. Only this time, he didn't come back. We searched for hours, combing the ice for any sign of him. No footprints, no gear, no body, just gone. We called in the satellite phone, reported his disappearance, but out here, there's no rescue team standing by. It could take days, weeks even, for anyone to reach us. Lyle was convinced he must have fallen into a crevasse, an accident. But I knew better. I'd seen that thing moving beneath the ice, and I couldn't shake the feeling that Carver didn't just fall. That night, I woke to a strange noise. It wasn't the wind. It was a low, guttural sound vibrating through the station walls. I jumped out of my bunk and rushed to the window. Outside, under the weak glow of the Arctic twilight, I saw it. Something massive, shifting beneath the snow, its shape barely discernible, but unmistakably alive. It was moving towards the station. I scrambled to wake Lyle, my heart pounding in my chest. "It's out there. Something's moving." Lyle, half asleep and groggy, brushed me off. "Calm down. It's probably just—" A loud crash cut him off, shaking the station violently. We both froze, staring at each other in shock. Then came another crash, closer this time, followed by a sickening tearing sound, like something was ripping through the ice itself. I grabbed a flashlight and flung open the door, desperate to see what was happening. Outside, the ground was trembling. The snow and ice were buckling, cracking open like a gaping wound. And there, rising from the dark abyss below, was something I can barely describe. It was enormous, its body slick and black, glistening like the ice it had torn apart. Tentacle-like appendages snaked across the surface, each one as thick as a tree trunk, probing the snow-covered ground. Its head, or what I assumed was its head, was featureless, smooth and reflective, with no eyes, no mouth. But it moved with purpose, as though it could sense us. Lyle screamed, stumbling backward into the station, but I was frozen in place, transfixed by the horror unfolding in front of me. This thing had been lying beneath us the entire time, dormant, waiting, and now it was awake. I snapped back to reality when one of its appendages slammed into the side of the station, sending a spray of ice and debris into the air. I dove back inside, slamming the door shut, my mind racing. We had no weapons, no way to defend ourselves against something like that. We were trapped. "We need to get out of here," Lyle shouted, grabbing the satellite phone. But the line was dead. No signal, just static. Of course, it was useless now. We were alone. Completely alone. The creature circled the station, its appendages scraping against the walls, searching, probing. It knew we were inside. Lyle was pacing, muttering to himself, while I sat, paralyzed, trying to think. There had to be a way out. There had to be. And then I remembered the snowcat, the only vehicle we had. It was parked a short distance from the station, our lifeline to civilization. If we could reach it, we might stand a chance. But getting there meant crossing open ground, directly in the path of that thing. "We have to make a run for the snowcat," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Lyle stared at me like I was insane. But what other choice did we have? Stay here and wait for it to tear the station apart, or take our chances out there? It wasn't much of a choice. We gathered what little we could: warm clothing, a flare gun with a single shot, and a small pack of supplies. The plan was simple: make a break for the snowcat and drive south as fast as possible. But nothing about this felt simple. We waited for a lull in the creature's movements, then burst out the door, running through the snow as fast as our legs would carry us. The cold bit at my face, each breath burning in my lungs, but I didn't dare look back. I could hear it behind us, the crunch of ice and the scraping of those terrible limbs growing louder by the second. We were almost at the snowcat when Lyle tripped, falling face first into the snow. I turned back to help him, but it was too late. One of the creature's appendages lashed out, wrapping around his leg and dragging him across the ice. His screams echoed through the empty wasteland as he was pulled beneath the surface, disappearing into the darkness. I reached the snowcat, tears freezing on my face, hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys. I managed to start it, the engine roaring to life, and without thinking, I floored the accelerator, tearing across the frozen landscape. I drove for hours, maybe days. I can't even remember. The creature never followed. At least I don't think it did. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, somewhere beneath the ice, waiting for the next group of researchers to stumble across its ancient, icy prison. I made it back to a small outpost eventually, delirious and half-frozen, babbling about monsters in the ice. They didn't believe me, of course. Who would? They said I was suffering from exposure, hallucinations brought on by the cold and isolation. But I know what I saw, and whatever it was, it's still out there.